And it was that experience of becoming a mom that really gave me compassion for how hard it is to be a parent and how hard it is to make decisions. And at the end of the day, she wanted to keep me safe. And she thought the best way to do that was to not vaccinate me. And I want to keep my kids safe. And I know the best way to do that is to vaccinate them. And that's why they are both fully vaccinated on time, even though that is not what I experienced as my own childhood.
You talked about who she was. It does not sound like she was a malicious person. She was doing what she thought was best. You mentioned that, and I think that's so important to hear. How has that shaped your view of how we should approach vaccine hesitant parents or people now? Or has it?
Sat down and I've talked to so many parents who have concerns about vaccines. And what I found is that we all have the same goal of keeping our kids safe. That is ultimately the thing that unites all of us. And yelling at each other and being angry at each other is not going to be a way of finding a way forward or changing minds. And I have changed minds, but it has taken building relationships and being compassionate with people as they grapple with the decision and as they grapple with what information is accurate versus not.
Welcome back to the Peds Doc Talk podcast. I am Dr. Mona, your pediatrician, mom, friend, confidant, and guide through everything parenting, child health, and development. If you're watching this, you're on our YouTube channel. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and share this episode with a friend so that we can continue to grow this channel, because I get to have the most amazing guests. And the only way I can do this is if you support the show and the channel. Today's guest is Dr. Elisabeth Marnik, scientist and science communicator, Science Whiz Liz on social media, and chief scientific officer of Those Nerdy Girls. And she had written a newsletter that I really was impacted by, talking about how she grew up in a home where parents didn't vaccinate, and now she's done a complete 180 and is a science educator and vaccine proponent and vaccinates herself. So she's on my show today to talk about from being hesitant to hopeful, why some parents or people don't vaccinate, and how we can bridge the gap so that we can hopefully get more people vaccinated rather than pushing them away. Thank you so much, Dr. Liz, for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
It is an honor to have you as well. You know, we have been friends. I put that in quotes, but I do consider you my social media friend. It's weird that we can have these parasocial relationships online. This is my first time connecting with you, obviously via video chat for this conversation. But for anyone who's not familiar with who you are, if you could introduce yourself and kind of what inspired you to start your channel, but also inspired you to write that article about your own experience growing up in a, I don't know if the right term is anti-vaccine home, but you can kind of clarify how you viewed it as a child.
Yeah, so I am a mom of two. I have a 6-year-old and a daughter who's about to turn 3 next week. I am a scientist, and like you mentioned, I'm a science communicator. And my growing up, I would say I was in an anti-science household because it wasn't just vaccines that my parents were against, but that was the big one that really kind of impacted a lot of my life. I was homeschooled for a long period of time. My first science class that I remember was actually in 11th grade,
Oh,
which is
wow.
wild to think about. And it was that science class that changed my life and really set me on this trajectory to eventually go to college and get my PhD and all of those things. But I wrote that article that you found, and I think I titled it "The Same Reason I Vaccinate My Kids is the Reason My Mom Didn't Vaccinate Me."
Yes.
And I didn't really understand growing up why she made that decision. So I remember hearing conversations, and she was very anxious in general. She still is a very anxious
Mhm.
person. And I remember her talking about vaccines very adamantly against them in these conversations. So this is just information I was steeped with. And I didn't really think much of it. And I don't even think I understood what the immune system was until I eventually went to college. And then once I got to college and I started learning science and I was a science major, I really started to get angry at that decision that she made.
Mm.
And it really put a strain, that plus other things really put a strain on our relationship. But then I had my own babies. And once I had a really rough birth with my son Owen, I hemorrhaged and lost and needed multiple blood transfusions and then had a very challenging postpartum. And I remember having this baby in my arms, thinking about how enormous the responsibility was to keep him safe. And it was that experience of becoming a mom that really gave me compassion for how hard it is to be a parent
Yeah.
and how hard it is to make decisions. And at the end of the day, she wanted to keep me safe. And she thought the best way to do that was to not vaccinate me. And I want to keep my kids safe. And I know the best way to do that is to vaccinate them. And that's why they are both fully vaccinated on time, even though that is not what I experienced as my own childhood.
You're already bringing up such an important concept in that we think that people who do not vaccinate, all of them, by the way, there's different spectrums of why someone may choose not to vaccinate, is that everyone at the core is thinking that this is the best decision for their child, right? Like, and it is interesting that we, myself included, think that, and we feel that, yes, the benefits outweigh the risk, and there's a whole group of people that look at it as something completely dangerous, or that how would I ever inject terminology that I don't like, poison into my kid or something
Mm.
like this, and it's so interesting. Sometimes you feel like you're in this alternate universe. You're like, "Wait, we're looking at the same thing. How are we looking at this completely different?" What about that science class made you change your sort of viewpoint on science? Was it the teacher? Was it what you were learning? I'm curious about what happened there for you.
I think it was all of the above. It was really a
Mhm.
process. So I entered college with a vaccine exemption still. So
Mhm.
I didn't have any vaccines when I entered college. And honestly, I wasn't even thinking about it.
Yeah.
But I was taking these classes and I was starting to learn about the scientific process. I started to learn about the immune system and how it worked. I started to learn about pathogens, and some of them are frankly pretty terrifying. And I was starting to put all of this information together. But then I started having conversations, and I had conversations with my friends in classes, and I started to see how different their life was compared to how I was raised, because I like to say that I grew up in a bubble. So
Yeah.
because of how I was raised, my parents were also very religious, so I wasn't allowed to drink alcohol, I couldn't dance, I wasn't allowed to watch Disney movies. So I lived in this very isolated kind of bubble. So when I got to college, I was having these conversations and I started to realize that I had been told that there was one right way to be a good human, and that was
Mm.
to be religious in this very specific way. And I started to realize that that wasn't true. And then that was when I started to kind of deconstruct all of the things that I had been raised with. And I started having conversations with my friends and my professors about vaccination, talking about the things that I remember my mom telling me about vaccines. And it was through both that knowledge and then those relationships that I built that made me eventually feel confident to go get vaccinated as an adult. And I actually got vaccinated about 4 months before I went to get my PhD, when I knew I likely was going to be in an immunology lab. And by that point, I was like, I understand the science, I
Yeah.
understand why vaccines are beneficial, and I'm going to go do this. And I went, and I was like 23 at the time.
And, your mom, you talked about who she was. It does not sound like she was a malicious person. She was doing what she thought was best. You mentioned that, and I think that's so important to hear. How has that shaped your view of how we should approach vaccine hesitant parents or people now? Or has it?
It has for sure. And
Mhm.
I don't know, when that first child died of measles a few months ago
Yeah.
in Texas because of the measles outbreak, I saw a lot of people making fun of the situation, really saying horrible things about those parents.
Yes.
And that didn't sit right with me for multiple reasons, particularly because that could have been me.
Mhm.
If life had turned out differently in many ways, that could have been a situation that happened to me. So I posted a video about how I really felt like we needed to focus on empathy, and that would be the way of moving forward. And so many people got mad at me for that video. I
Like
was
people in the science community? Like people who
Yes,
are yes, that seems to happen,
yes.
and we can talk about that too. Mhm.
Yes, but people got so mad at me. But ultimately, I mean, I don't care about that,
Yeah.
right? Because I have sat down and I've talked to so many parents who have concerns about vaccines. And what I found is that we all have the same goal of keeping our kids safe. That is ultimately the thing that unites all of us. And yelling at each other and being angry at each other is not going to be a way of finding a way forward or changing minds. And I have changed minds, but it has taken building relationships and being compassionate with people as they grapple with the decision and as they grapple with what information is accurate versus not.
And I feel the same way. So when I came out of residency, I was in that mindset that if someone refuses a vaccine, I've already kind of put them into this category that they don't care, they don't want to listen, that they're an anti-vaxxer, and that's it, right? And it was a very negative perception of that person.
Mhm.
And it was when I became a mother, and that's kind of the tipping, like you talked about how that did it for you as
Mhm.
well. It was when I became a mother that I started to realize that same concept, that I do believe truly that people are trying to do the best for their child. And if they're choosing not to, there's a reason behind it. Maybe it's from misinformation, maybe it's distrust for a medical system, which I see a lot of. And I think as a medical community, on my side, we need to recognize that the medical community has done a huge disservice because of the way it's structured, right? The short visit times, the sometimes some doctors who are very, you're going to do this because I say so. And I kind of equate it to parenting, that sometimes we don't realize that how that doesn't work in parenting, it's also not going to work in a doctor's office with a peer, like with someone who's also an adult, right? Well, it's because I said so. It's because I know better. It's because I'm more educated. What do you mean you didn't, you read that online? That doesn't mean anything. What do you know? Imagine if we talk to a child that way, how off putting that is for all of our listeners who are parents. Human beings don't want to be talked to that way. And it's that experience that sort of
Yeah.
helped me reach those vaccine hesitant families a little bit more, right? I can't really turn the mind of someone who has gone so deep on the other side that they're, slamming papers down, calling me a shill, saying all these terms that are really not kind. But I can get through to those curious patients that are just like, hey, I want to do this, but I read that this is going to happen and I don't know. And I have been able to. And it
Mhm.
hasn't been through, well, you just got to listen to me because I said so. It's been through, tell me, what are you hearing? What is on your
Mhm.
mind? What are you worried about? And what is it that you're thinking about, and where are you getting that information so I can talk to you about it? And like you said, I think when we change that perspective of like, these people are not bad people, they're not malicious, they're not horrible people that don't care, that
Yeah.
is huge. And like your point, I think the science community online can also do a huge disservice when we go to the other extreme, right? Like the if you don't do this, then you're a bad person. I myself got a lot of flack for how my stance on the COVID vaccine. I am very much a let's decide together. Not that everyone needs it. I'm like, let's do joint decision making more so than any other vaccine out there. And from the pro science community, I got a lot of pushback. Like, how dare you? And I'm like, no, I'm having conversations. I'm not saying nobody needs it. And I bring that up because there is a middle ground where we can have these conversations with families, but keep the science there. And I think by doing that, we can turn people around, like maybe for you, and say, you know what? I believe this. I believe the science. It's something where benefits outweigh risk. But if we join them like this, like butting
Right.
heads, it's not going to go anywhere.
No, and I think that's a really important point. What I didn't get to yet is that when I finally had my own children, I sat down and I had a conversation with my mom,
Yeah.
and she brought up the fact that I was her first child, and this
Hmm.
was in the 80s, and she went to that pediatrician appointment shortly after I was born, having heard some scary story about vaccines. And she went to
Mm,
that doctor and she asked him some questions, and he did exactly what you said. He told her, "You vaccinate your kid because I told you to."
mm,
And she then left, and I never went back to a pediatrician or a doctor until I was a teenager and started having some other health problems. And I'm not going to blame just that one interaction, but that really helped push her towards this
yeah.
whole mindset where I have to beg her to go to the doctor if she starts having health challenges. She had cellulitis once, and I had to beg her to go get antibiotics for it. So it really is, I think, I like to tell people that I don't think that we can have providers be the only one fixing this issue because of our healthcare system. It is broken. You don't have
Yeah.
enough time in those short minute visits to have these hard conversations. But we also need to acknowledge the fact that people are coming into these conversations probably having been dismissed by prior individuals with questions. And that's not going to help change the situation either.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this in past posts and
Yeah.
podcasts that we are pushing them into the hands of pseudoscience. Many of this sort of modern healthcare system, and that if they're not feeling seen and heard by us, they are going to feel seen and heard by some account that says, "I get it. You've been injured, or this person was injured, and this side effect." And sadly, me and you both know, and I know this truly, is that there's a lot of extrapolation on that end too, right? Like making things up, making up side effects, making up stories to further an
Mm.
agenda, which on both sides is not fair, right? On our end, when I say our end, I say the pro science, like I understand that benefits outweigh risk. I will always be truthful on the stories that I've seen, right? The kids that have been impacted by vaccine preventable illnesses, the side effects I've seen,
Mm.
but I expect that from the other side as well, which doesn't always happen. And
Right.
so parents who are making decisions need truth. And sadly, both sides are, this happened in the pandemic, like the peak of the pandemic as well. Like we need to be honest about what we're seeing and, what's being reported to like VAERS and all of that. And it's not always honest. And that is not fair to anyone in the scientific process.
Yeah, I think we just have to realize that again, if we want to build from that common ground, we can get a lot farther. So, starting from a place of understanding what's motivating them, why they might have concerns, even if the concerns might seem a little crazy to you, like they're
Yeah.
still very real concerns to the person that you're talking to. And you can start from there in terms of trying to build up to have these difficult conversations and maybe eventually help change those minds.
And so, for people who assume that vaccine hesitancy is ignorant or selfish, you may see those terms thrown around. What do you wish those people better understood about where those fears really come from?
So I think there's a couple things. So one is that we assume, and I saw this a lot on that post that I mentioned earlier, people were like, well, the information is out there. And if they don't
Mm,
see it or they don't believe it, then it's their fault. And I have a lot of issues with that because my mother never went past eighth grade and she has pretty challenging difficulties navigating like forms and finding information. Still and have always had to help her with like paperwork and stuff like that. So there's issues related to access in that way. But also that assumes that there is like that's a lot of privilege to say
yeah.
that somebody can find the information and access the information and then be able to figure out, well, what is true information versus false information? Because false information can look pretty sophisticated, especially
Yeah.
these days. So just because it's obvious to you does not mean it's obvious to the person who's coming to you with these concerns. And if you automatically say, oh, you're stupid for thinking
Yeah.
this way, that's not going to change minds. In fact, there's so much data out there that shows that facts don't change minds, which is
Mm.
hard, right? As somebody who is a scientist, I love data. I like facts. I like information. That was really hard for me to grapple with. Facts will not change minds. You can use them, but that alone will not be enough for you if you want to change somebody's mind or if you want to build a relationship with somebody. Empathy, storytelling, asking questions, building relationships, those are the things that ultimately will change minds.
Well, it's so funny because, like I said earlier, this sounds so much like parenting, right? I mean, you have two small children. Like, if I really believe it's the same, and I'm not saying that our peers, like fellow adults, are little children in their development. I'm just saying like how we would talk to a child in terms of wanting them to learn something, wanting them to do something. You would never dismiss that. You would always prioritize the empathy, the connection over anything before mommy said to do this, And I use that as an example because I like to take parenting skills into the real world because it all comes down to communication, right? I mean, we know that in any healthy relationship, communication is the foundation, whether it's friendship, whether it's romantic, whether it's parent child, whether it's doctor
Mhm.
patient, whether it's science communicator and their audience. And so
Mhm.
that matters. And there is an art to doing it. And I agree with you completely that I think we can better get to those people by that empathy and that connection. And, we talked about this already with the mistrust, not just of medicine, but of systems. So maybe school, government, healthcare. And your mom also had that one experience with the doctor who kind of dismissed her and said, well, it's because I said so. How does that broader mistrust fuel vaccine resistance, especially amongst communities that feel unseen or unheard? Or maybe using your mom as an example of how did that transcend into other aspects besides healthcare when she felt that sort of feeling of dismissal?
For sure. And I think this is a really important thing that often is missing from our side of the conversation, right?
Mhm.
I think we like to assume everything is fine, but
Yeah.
we need to acknowledge the fact that the system is broken. And we have, depending on what community you're a part of, like the Tuskegee trials, like there has been very understandable reasons for certain communities to distrust science. And it's only through acknowledging that and saying, yes, I understand, like we did this and it was horrible, that we can start to again build that bridge. And in my mom's case, yes, she has great mistrust of all institutions in general. I didn't talk about, I mentioned briefly how I was homeschooled. So I was in public school for a little bit. And then she started to be concerned that public school was going to corrupt me.
Mm,
I wasn't allowed to go on field trips because she didn't trust that anyone else would take care of me the same way that she would take care of me. So she really just went down this spiral of, I think part of that was also anxiety, right?
yeah.
So sometimes it's hard to tease out what was really more motivating. But she really went into this whole area of just not trusting systems in general and not even utilizing. For a long time, we were struggling to put food on the table, and she wouldn't even apply for food stamps. So
Mm,
sometimes she would rather, like, in her opinion, not eat. She made sure we ate as kids, but she didn't trust
yeah.
the government to actually even provide that resource for her. So it really did start to impact multiple areas of her life and our life as we were growing up.
Yeah, and you had siblings or no siblings?
I have a brother. He's
You have a
younger than
brother.
me.
Did
Yes.
he have the same impact of, obviously being in that same sort of not vaccinating and changing his mind, or was that more so you because of your education?
So interesting, my brother is now fully vaccinated as well.
Okay.
And he also got vaccinated as an adult because he wanted to go to, my father is actually a minister,
Okay.
and he was going to go with my father on a missions trip to a country
Mm,
that needed a bunch of vaccines. And he finally went and got all of his vaccines as far as I know. I think maybe he's
nice.
missing some, but he is now vaccinated.
Yeah, such an interesting story. I think this is so great to hear, and I'm so glad that you wrote that newsletter, and I will be linking it because it's on your Substack, correct? Like,
Yes,
if
it
people
is.
can
Yes.
access it, yeah. I'm gonna
Yes.
be linking it because I think it's such an important perspective. You guys can already hear how it's such an important perspective given that Liz is now a hardcore science communicator. I mean, she's one of my favorite accounts on social, and kinda reiterating why she's one of my favorite is that when she presents things, it's very much this, "Hey, here's what we know, but there's little judgment," meaning there's none of that sort of, if you don't do this you are a horrible parent and da da da. It's very much like, I'm just going to present this, here's what we know, and that's what it should be, and I think i I used to be very much the rolling eyes, judgmental person against this. Like I said, I'm being very transparent about that because I think it's also important to see that we can evolve, that we can
Yeah.
be like a certain way. And for me, it was my thought process around people who didn't vaccinate. Now it's a little more understanding than I used to be. And I think that is growth in myself. And I think that's, like I said, opened up so much more communication and connection with so many more patients that feel like they can trust me for other things as well, because I'm not dismissive about their concern of what they read online about vaccines or what they read online about some other thing related to
Right.
health, parenting, or development. And so now, as both a scientist and educator, how do you balance the data with empathy when discussing vaccines, especially with those who may have deep-seated fears or generational mistrust with the system or with vaccination?
Yeah, so I usually approach this conversation first from listening.
Hmm.
So I think a lot of times our first instinct, particularly as a scientist, right, is when they say something, you immediately want to be like, no, that's not true,
Hmm.
or whatever, right? You want to interject. I usually start a conversation just listening. I want to listen to what are they worried about? I try to ask questions. So, where did you hear this information? How did that make you feel? What concerns do you have?
Yeah.
What kind of information would help you make a decision? Because finding those things out can really help me figure out, okay, what is it that they're worried about? Where is that potentially coming from? And then from there, it helps me frame the information that I present them in a way that might be the most helpful for them. So, and again, I always like to acknowledge that it's hard to be a parent because a lot of the times I'm having these conversations with fellow parents. It's
Hmm.
hard to keep your kids safe in a world that makes it, especially in the US, it's so hard to be a parent.
Yeah.
So hard to have to balance all of these things when there's not that support for you. So I like to acknowledge that. And then I start to bring in information as I feel it is appropriate and useful and in a way that is tailored to their identity. So if they're a parent, then I frame the information related to the benefits of vaccination, the data that we do have. But I don't start with data. I
Yeah.
first start with figuring out, okay, what are they worried about? What do they care about? And then how can I frame this information in a way that might reach them? I also sometimes don't even do it in the first conversation.
Yeah.
This stuff takes a long time. It takes sometimes multiple conversations over multiple months to have these kinds of conversations. And this is why I don't think it can just be a job for providers. I think we all have a role in our community. Friends are also trusted, right? Friends, family members, you can have these conversations and really make a big impact so that it isn't just one person who is always having to carry the weight. But it's you have to be patient. And I think this is the thing I get a lot of times is people will comment, well, I tried that and it didn't work.
Yeah.
And sometimes you might think it didn't work. I've had conversations where I've left and I'm like, that person is never going to change their mind. But I was like, I planted seeds and that's all I could do. And then I will find out years later that like actually they did eventually go and get their kid vaccinated. Or if it wasn't about I have these conversations related to other things too, they eventually changed their minds about that. So I think you never know what impact your conversations will be having, but I can tell you that if you go to them and you tell them they're stupid,
Yeah.
that is immediately going to put up a wall. And then no matter what else you tell them, they're not going to listen. And you've lost an opportunity to plant seeds that could eventually bear fruit in the future.
Love that. I love that phrase you just said, plant seeds to bear fruit in the future, because that is what it is. And no human being in this world wants to be told that they're stupid or that their information or where they got their information is pointless. Like, even if we feel it's not a good source, right? So I use the example of like certain podcasts or other accounts, right? Like, even if I don't like it and I know that they constantly spew information that's not accurate, I need to first get to that feeling, get to that connection, like you said. And as a clinician, I can attest to the fact that I may have that visit at the 1 month visit, that conversation about, hey, we're going to be starting vaccines at 2 months. They have a lot of questions. The 2 month rolls around. They're like, hey, I don't know. I think I just want to do one and come back. And I say, hey, look, I'd rather have you do one and then we can do that. And then we'll come back in a week. You can do the next one. And then I've had families do one versus all of them together.
Mhm.
And I am more open to that than the you got to do all of them together because that's what's best. Because I rather have the family get all of them in off schedule than none of them at all. Right. That's kind of my
Exactly.
middle ground with how I approach patients. And some people will say, well, you should just tell them that it's safe. I'm like, of course I'm talking to them about that, but they still have their reservations. And I can't get into their psyche completely to understand all of their reservations. But we can reach a compromise that makes sense where I'm feeling like the child is more protected than not. And they're feeling like they're taking it slower if
Mhm.
that's what they want for their kid. And I
Mhm.
have had DMs, I've had patients in my office tell me that it was those conversations that made them want to do the vaccine. And it's like literally the best part of this job, right? Is that yes, it took a
Mhm.
lot of time, Liz. Like
Yeah.
I think that's another a hard part is that so many pediatricians now poo-poo those conversations because we typecast these people into being, they're not going to ever do it. So why am I going to even bother having the convo? And it's because I'm going to be honest, I've seen it because we don't have that time. It takes 20, 30 minutes to have a conversation about vaccines versus, okay, you're not going to do it. I'm not going to see you until next time. 5 minutes done, and you can move on to the next patient. And that is a sad reality of the healthcare system. I strongly believe if
Right.
we had more time, we'd be having more people get vaccinated because we could explain all the things that you said, the heart to heart, and then maybe a little bit of data if they want the data, or maybe just a little bit of personal story, right? Like, hey, I was
Mhm.
nervous too. My son had strokes. I think you had shared some stories about your children, but like my son had a stroke. I was scared about giving him a vaccine because I didn't know if he'd have a seizure because of this. And those stories really help people feel seen and they don't feel like you're just talking down to them, but talking to them because that's all anyone
Yeah.
wants.
Yeah, and I think that storytelling is a really important aspect because I don't like saying like right, if you think about I don't like saying asides, right? So I know the
Hmm.
other, but like if we think about what the other side does, if we think about the people who are profiting off of misinformation do,
Yeah.
is they usually tell a very scary story about
Hmm.
it, right? And who knows if that story is true? A lot of times when we've done digging, it has been completely made up
Yes.
or
Yes.
completely misrepresented. But they just tell these stories, and stories are actually our brain is wired for that storytelling. And as a scientist, that has really been a shift that I've been trying to do in the kind of communication that I do is I try to lead with a story. And that story
Hmm.
is still rooted in reality, it's still grounded in data, but it is a story that illustrates why this type of thing matters. And that is more impactful ultimately because those are the things that will stick in your mind more than like percentages or data
Yeah.
points or numbers. That stuff is not going to be remembered by people, but the story and how it made them feel and the impact of that is something that will carry through to whatever happens next.
And I think you already alluded to this, but we're talking about this sort of pro-vax, anti-vax, like the sort of sides that happen, right? Like there seems to be dichotomies of like, okay, it has to be extremes, but you argue that the reality is more complex. So what are we missing when we reduce this to a binary conversation that you're pro-vax, pro-science, anti-vax, anti-science? Who are we missing? What are we missing when we do this to our community and our conversations?
So when we look at the available information we have right now, the majority of people still do value vaccination.
Hmm.
That's just true by numbers. Yes, we have seen some declines in rates of kids entering kindergarten, but overall the majority still do value vaccinations. So when we just separate it out into these two dichotomies, we're missing all of those people in the middle who are concerned, who have questions. Again, because they're being flooded by all of this false information online all of the time. By again, people who are profiting off of this, which is when
Yeah,
I get mad, I don't get mad at the parent who is concerned for their kid. I get mad at the people who are profiting off of that when they
correct.
know it's not true and vaccinate their own kids.
Correct.
Those are who I get mad at, and those are people who deserve to be mad at. It's not the parents who are trying to navigate these things. So when we just think about it as just that two sides, we're missing all of those people in the middle who really just need somebody to talk to them and need to have their questions answered. And maybe they won't make the decision you want them to make right away, but at least you've had that conversation. And believe me, the anti-vax people are having these conversations all the time, so by us not engaging and not wanting to have those conversations because we think they're too hard or we get mad or we think they're a waste of time, we're letting more and more people move towards that side, which is not what we want. Because the reality is most people are just concerned and they're in the middle, not sure what to do.
Right. And I think on social it's a little bit different for me because sometimes I'll get the DMs that are like, the same old thing. Like I mean that when I know they're just trolling me. Like there's a difference
Yes.
between trolls versus actual
Yes.
intentional things because recently I posted something and that same tired conversation of like, you're only sharing this because you get a kickback. And I'm like, how many times I have to tell you that pediatricians are the lowest paid specialty? And if we actually got kickbacks, we would be one of the highest paid specialty, but we're not. We're all driving our little cars that get us to point A to point B, and
Yep.
we are not rolling in the dough. But I can't keep explaining that. And that can get a little frustrating when it's on
Yes.
social. But of course, this is far more than just social. This is like, the face-to-face
Right.
conversations that we're having. And
Right.
even with social, I am able to connect to people via
Hmm.
my free resources or things that I have around vaccines. And to your point, my vaccine guide that I have is always free, completely free, whereas
Mm.
other accounts are like, this vaccine causes this, comment ebook for my $20 ebook on how to
Yeah.
advocate for vaccines. And I'm like, hey, I'm telling you this information for free on my YouTube and on my
Yeah.
guide that will forever be free because I believe that this education should be free. And to your point, that also drives me up a little wall of like, that is not fair. This is disinformation. This is intentionally saying that this is going to be harmful, da da da, to make money.
Right.
And that is fear based propaganda. And I myself don't like that as well.
And it's ironic a little bit because again, I also get like pharma shill comments to me all the time. And but they don't seem that there is that dichotomy where, okay, but these people are selling supplements and they're selling
Yes.
guides and detox things. Like there's also like
A
that,
business.
and that's in their bio most of the time.
Yeah. I mean, and everything is I mean, I will be the first to say everything is a business in a way, right? I mean,
Yeah.
everyone's trying to make a living. I have made it that I believe that health education should always be free. But of course, I have
Hmm.
some things behind a paywall, like parenting tips that are more
Right.
detailed or things like that. But in my head, I'm like, I don't want to make health content something that someone has to pay for. That's
Right.
something that I decided to do. But maybe someone else will do something different. But when you're starting it with fear, you are going with the intention that you are touching those heartstrings of like, oh my God, my kid is going to die if I get X, Y, or Z, or not, right? And then you're selling something that way, which is the worst way to sell things. It's commonly done because it sells, but it's not, to me, a high integrity situation.
I agree.
Now, in a time when so many of these discussions feel combative, what is your kind of final feeling of how we can reframe this, around the shared values? Like I said, I think we all care for our children, we care for our communities, but what can we do to kind of build that trust again, build that sort of faith in science again, and get people, curious about vaccines and not against them, if you will?
Yeah, so I think we need to first take some of this offline. I
Hmm.
think online is very polarizing. I believe science and medical and like health content, all of that stuff should be accessible online because that's where people are. But I also feel like we can't rely on that as our only way of having these challenging conversations. So I try to have these conversations in community. So
Yeah.
meet local moms for coffee if they have questions and sit down with them and see what their concerns about. Obviously that takes longer and takes more time, but we can all do that in ways when we think about it because you probably know moms in your community who are vaccine hesitant, who have
Yeah.
questions, right? And I interviewed Adam Ratner on my Instagram Live a few weeks ago, or maybe a few months ago now. He wrote the book Booster Shots about measles.
Okay.
And in that conversation, we were talking about how what we really need is a what we really need is a like whole culture where we talk about the success
Yeah.
because these things are often invisible. So well, you will see scary stories on social media, but then you don't necessarily see like, oh, all the times my kid has gotten vaccinated and went to play at the park later
Right.
or went to play games later. So a lot of this is invisible. And I do
Yeah.
think that's one thing that can be valuable that we need to start talking more about the way in which science in general just benefits our lives through new discoveries, through new cures, through all of these things, and really make that more part of our culture. So share those simple things, share those stories, share, hey, my kid got vaccinated today and is totally fine, right? So be more open with those conversations. But then ultimately, I think just be willing to sit down and listen to when somebody is concerned
Yeah.
and try to understand what it is that's motivating that concern and try to find the common ground, whatever that common ground is. Usually, if you're a parent, the easiest thing is wanting to keep your kids safe
Yeah.
because that is that common ground. And then from there, you can again build in those conversations and in that information. But I think we just need to, in general, be more willing to have conversations like this. They are uncomfortable, they are hard, and they can kind of, depending on how extroverted or introverted you are, they can kind of make you cringe inside.
Yes.
But they're important to have. And I really feel like one of the things I now think about in my role is I know that social media builds an echo chamber.
Hmm.
It's unfortunate, right? So I know most of my followers probably already value science.
Yeah.
So I'm really trying to move more into ways that I can equip them to then go out and have these conversations in their own communities because that is where the biggest impact will be is having these conversations in communities, in moms groups, in faith centers because that's where the people are and that's where you can have that face-to-face interaction that often makes the biggest difference.
I love that. I love that perspective. I love how you are taking what you know and what you want to do, but obviously escalating it, elevating it to the greater good. Another reason why I loved having you on the show. What you said, these conversations are important. So, having you on to talk about this as a fellow science communicator with the history and childhood that you had, it was so awesome. Like, I just really appreciate you taking the time today. Where can people go to stay connected? Obviously, your social handles, your newsletter, things like that.
Yeah, so I am most active on Instagram at
Hmm.
Science Wiz, Wiz, Liz, Liz. But you can also find me at that same handle on all the other social media platforms as well. And then I have a Substack newsletter called From the Science Classroom.
Perfect.
And then I'm going to put in a plug for Those Nerdy Girls. I am the chief scientific officer for Those Nerdy Girls. We're a nonprofit where we translate health and science topics for the general public in ways that are understandable and actionable. So what should you do with this information once you know it?
Well,
And you can,
I'm a
yep,
nerdy girl.
sorry.
I'm a nerdy girl myself, so
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead.
I know we all are, right?
Yeah.
And the handle for that is Those Nerdy Girls.
Perfect. Well, I am going to be including those resources in our show notes. Definitely give Science Wiz Liz a follow. And if you love this episode, please make sure you share it. Like we talked about, the more we have these conversations and the more people know that it's not supposed to be divisive, that it actually can be this middle ground, I think we can really reach more people. So share this on social media, send it to a Facebook group, send it to your communities. It can really help spark these really compassionate conversations surrounding science and vaccination. Thank you again, Liz, for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
And for everyone, again, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please make sure you subscribe. Leave a comment if you found this video helpful, and I cannot wait to chat with another guest next time.